Hello, this is William Hong from First Stay Realty Inc. Our website is www.firststaybc.com and the best number to contact 778-317-6393. Today, I've prepared a detailed discussion regarding one of the most incredibly stressful and difficult situations that many home sellers experience when investing. Specifically, it's about exactly what steps you should take when your house hasn't sold even after being listed on the market for over 3 months. Let's get right into the heart of the matter today. You've gone ahead and listed your house for sale, but unfortunately, it hasn't sold even after 3 months. So, what kind of difficult situation are we looking at here? In many cases, when I receive a formal listing consultation request and personally visit the property to conduct a professional listing presentation with the seller, I always make it a point to emphasize that the very first 3 weeks after listing are absolutely vital. If you simply cannot manage to sell your house during that critical initial period, the chances of selling drop significantly to well below 50%. I repeatedly and consistently stress this vital point to every client I meet. In reality, only about 50% of people actually accept and follow this advice, but more than 50% of sellers react with a great deal of skepticism. They often find themselves wondering exactly what I'm talking about, perhaps thinking I'm just trying to rush the listing process for my own personal benefit, or even suspecting I'm trying to scam them. This is especially true for first-time sellers who have no prior experience. No matter how much I emphasize the importance of this window, they remain deeply doubtful and don't really believe the data. As a direct result of this doubt, they often choose to start with an overpriced listing. I've seen this exact scenario happen so many times throughout my career. Even when I offer to provide detailed weekly feedback and suggest making necessary adjustments to the listing price or strategy, many people still don't follow my advice. Then, after about 3 months have passed by, they finally start worrying about what they should do next. I've seen so many cases exactly like this that it's actually the primary reason I decided to start my own YouTube channel. I truly wanted to take every possible opportunity to educate people about these complex issues, to share my extensive knowledge and professional experience, and to explain in detail why there's a surge of interest in a property right at the start. I want people to understand why the first 3 weeks after listing are so incredibly important, and why the very first open house is crucial to your success. I wanted to provide a systematic education and clear guidance on these specific points, which is exactly why I started my journey on YouTube. As some of you may already know, I've been running a dedicated series called Easy to Understand Real Estate. This is currently the 7th episode in the series, and from the very first video until this moment, my consistent message has been that the first 3 weeks are the golden time for any seller. That's why this period offers the best opportunity to get the highest price and also the power to receive multiple offers. So whether it's the strength of receiving multiple offers or even if you only get a single offer, the period when you can sell your house for the highest price is within the first 3 weeks after it's first listed. Among those first 3 weeks, the very first week is the most important. This is something I've been emphasizing from the beginning until now. But the problem is, even though I say this, in reality, more than 50% of people, for one reason or another, don't cooperate on this point, and they miss that golden window of opportunity. Then, 2 or 3 months pass by just like that, and before you know it, about 3 months have gone by. So, what should you do in that situation? I'd like to talk about that. Still, I consider the first 3 months to be a normal selling period. Of course, selling within the first 3 weeks is the best, but up to about 3 months, buyers generally don't see any major issues with the house itself. The problem is, once it goes beyond 3 months, even if you do get an offer, the first question buyers ask is this: why hasn't it sold even after 3 months? Is there perhaps something wrong with this house? Or is the listing price just too high? They inevitably ask these kinds of questions and focus on them, so you end up getting lowball offers. The perception that there's something wrong with the house starts to emerge. Since it has now been more than 3 full months since you first listed, it is absolutely essential that you take some decisive action at this particular point in time. The reality of the situation is that the listing price, in fact, is actually dropping little by little every single day, even if you cannot physically see it happening on the screen. Even if you decide not to make any manual adjustments and just leave the listing price exactly as it is right now, in reality, the market value is quietly decreasing a bit each day. If you take a close look at the graph here, this specific shaded area represents what I always call the first 3 weeks. This is the moment of truth, the absolute golden time for any seller. That is a crucial 3-week window, and during this specific period, the listing price can be successfully maintained as is. Furthermore, if you are lucky enough to get an offer during this time, it will likely be the highest price you will ever see. But as more time passes, even if you visibly adjust the listing price later on, the amount it is invisibly dropping in the eyes of potential buyers is even greater than any discount you might offer. So, when exactly does this point occur? If you look at it as the time after 3 months have passed, at that particular point, you have lowered the listing price to about this level. Even if you are currently under the impression that you have lowered your initial property listing price by about 5%, in reality, the actual invisible financial drop you are seeing is more like well over 10% when you consider the market overall. Of course, it is important to note that this chart is quite subjective in nature. Although I personally created it myself by carefully compiling various different sources, what I really want to emphasize here is, first, that the initial 3 weeks, which we call the momentum period, are extremely important for your success. Second, even if you decide to adjust the listing price little by little, say by about 5% or so, the actual invisible effect on the market is almost a 10% drop in perceived value. So, this significant gap becomes the specific point where buyers and sellers must try to come to terms with one another. After 3 full months have passed, there's really nothing more to see. The gap between expectations just keeps widening further. The actual drop in the listing price and the psychological invisible price that buyers perceive, this psychological drop tends to be even greater than the numbers suggest. That's exactly why I spent so much time on the first slide, and once again I truly want to emphasize the critical importance of those first 3 weeks. If this initial phase fails, the key message is that you must do everything humanly possible to sell the property within the first 3 months. So, I've summarized the various reasons why a house doesn't sell into about 4 primary points. Above all else, the very first and most critical factor is the initial listing price. This is of course a very subjective matter, but in my professional opinion, the price accounts for more than 70% of the overall issue. Especially when starting with an overprice, many first-time sellers often say, well, it's quite easy to lower the listing price later on, but once it drops, you simply can't raise it back up again, right? Since it's easy to lower, let's start at the highest possible price and then adjust down if it doesn't work out. That's exactly what a lot of people tend to say. The problem is, those promises to lower the price are rarely ever kept. So, more than 50% of cases unfortunately start with overpricing. When I go to take a new listing, if it's overpriced as shown in the graph on the right, statistics clearly show that buyer interest drops to well below 30%, says Heitberg. This specific data is sourced from the Greater Vancouver Realtors Association. So, if you list at a reasonable market price, about 60% of potential buyers are exposed to and show genuine interest in the property. But if you list at about 10% over the current market price, that interest drops significantly to only 30%. Conversely, if you list at about 10% below the market price, the exposure and interest from buyers increases to about 75%. If you look at the gap, even though it's the same 10% margin, the difference is incredibly significant, isn't it? If you go from 60 to 30, that's a 30% drop, but from 60 to 75, that's only a 15% increase. In any case, starting your listing at more than 10% above the market price is extremely risky. It's practically a shortcut to a self-inflicted goal where your house won't sell. And this is a mistake that almost all first-time sellers make. By first-time sellers, I mean those who are selling their home for the first time and have no prior experience. The second issue is the condition of the house. If you haven't properly and thoroughly organized, tidied up, or prepared the house for sale, or if there's been a lack of maintenance and you list the property without fixing those minor issues, or if you haven't done any strategic staging to showcase the space, or if the house is significantly outdated and you haven't made any modern upgrades, or if the overall cleanliness is poor and there are strong lingering odors when you put the house on the market, these factors all work against you and can reduce your chances by about 20%. So, the price and the house condition together account for almost 90% of the entire selling process. In my professional experience, location issues make up about 5%, and potential issues related to your marketing strategy about another 5%, so these are relatively minor factors in the end. When it comes to the specific location, there are certain areas that are almost like isolated islands or pockets, where the buyer demand is significantly lower. It's hard for me to specify exactly which areas these are, but such difficult locations definitely exist. If you're trying to sell a house in one of those specific areas, unless the market is extremely hot and the overall market is absolutely booming, it's very difficult to sell. In a normal or even a slightly slow market, houses in those particular locations tend not to sell well at all. So if your house is situated in such a location, there's a much higher chance it won't sell. Also, a complete lack of proper market exposure, especially if the quality of the photos is poor. Furthermore, if the agent fails to respond actively to showings, these issues can create challenges that make the property more difficult to sell. However, these should not be considered major problems. The primary factors that remain are still the listing price and the overall condition of the house. And next, If you list your property once and then relist it a second time, a market history is created. While potential buyers themselves usually can't see this market history, professional buyer agents will always check it thoroughly. In fact, this task is one of the primary duties of all buyer agents. They might not necessarily look at it before showing a house, but when they are preparing to make a formal offer, they always check this specific information. Exactly how many times the property has been on and off the market, at what price it was originally listed, how much the price has been reduced over time, and so on. Since all real estate agents check this information, everything is completely visible to everyone. So if a property comes on the market once or even twice, if it fails the first time and is relisted a second time, that is somewhat understandable. But if it goes on and off the market 3 or 4 times, potential buyers and other agents begin to suspect there is a major problem. That is why I keep emphasizing that the first listing is the most important, and especially the first 3 weeks of that initial listing are absolutely vital and essential. If you have listened to my lectures before, you might feel like you have heard this 1,000 times already, but I truly believe and am absolutely confident about this point as a highly experienced and dedicated real estate professional. So, after a listing finally goes live on the market, the initial 3-week period is critical to the success of the sale. But to be a bit more thorough, I make it a priority to monitor the listing on a weekly basis for the first 4 weeks, or essentially the entire first month. There's no absolute right or wrong answer here. This is just the specific professional method that I personally use. I check in on a consistent weekly basis, and the most significant event that we look forward to is the very first open house. Up until that first open house occurs, I track exactly how many people visit the property, and I also gather feedback from those who attend through surveys. Based on this information, if we haven't received any formal offers by the end of the second week, I assess whether a strategic price adjustment might be necessary. I discuss these findings with the seller, considering both the total number of visitors and the specific feedback they provide. If it is deemed necessary, we might even decide to tweak or refine the property description to better attract buyers. In any case, during that entire first month, I monitor the price weekly, and if the situation warrants it, I will recommend necessary price adjustments. Especially when we start with a listing that is initially overpriced, I always make a point to mention this clearly to the seller. I make sure to have an honest conversation with them where I explain, of course it's your home, so the final decision is always yours to make, but I'll provide you with weekly feedback on the current market situation. If needed, please be open to the possibility of adjusting the price. That's exactly what I always say to my clients when we start with an overpriced listing. If the property hasn't sold by the end of the first month and we move into the second month, I switch to meticulously monitoring the situation every single 2 weeks. Every 2 weeks, I prepare a detailed CMA, comparative market analysis, and a comprehensive market situation report to share directly with the seller. Now, the key variable in the second month is this. If there are showings but no offers, in about 8 out of 10 cases, it's a clear indication that we are facing a significant pricing issue. If there are showings but no offers, or if showings are sparse or even non-existent, then it's not just a pricing problem, it's a comprehensive issue involving the home's location, marketing, staging, and overall condition. Also, if feedback from buyers consistently mentions that the price is too high, not just from 1 or 2 people but from many different parties, then it's definitely overpriced and a major price adjustment is absolutely necessary. If the property still doesn't sell, and we enter the third month, it's time to ask some very deep and fundamental questions and seriously reconsider our entire approach. Since we're now in the third month and really need to sell within this time frame, we have to consider whether to make a significant price reduction or perhaps even restage and relist the property entirely. So at this point, you need to fundamentally rethink and reevaluate the entire listing and marketing strategy from the ground up. When considering relisting, you also need to decide whether to keep your current agent, or if you feel that your current agent's responsiveness is lacking, you should also consider the possibility of changing agents. In fact, when a house doesn't sell, from the seller's perspective, the first scapegoat and the easiest reason to point to is usually the real estate agent. So sometimes homeowners blame their real estate agent when a house isn't selling, thinking it is because the agent didn't perform their job properly. Consequently, when it comes time for relisting the property, they may decide to switch to a new agent. Well, there is no single definitive answer to this situation, but if your current listing agent has been working diligently, just as I mentioned before, checking in with you weekly, providing feedback from every showing, and discussing potential price adjustments, then it is likely not just an agent issue or the agent's fault alone. The root cause of the problem may lie in the price point, the physical location, or perhaps the overall condition of the house itself. In that case, there is no real need to change agents. However, once you hit that 3-month mark, it is still important to seriously consider whether changing agents might be a necessary step. And and this is something you should carefully check and review at that time. Now, the term rebaking has frequently come up in our discussions. In professional real estate terms, the act of relisting a property is often referred to as rebaking, much like taking a loaf of bread and putting it back in the oven to give it a fresh, warm crust. The core meaning behind this rebaking strategy is to essentially present the property as if the listing is brand new to the market, even though it is actually the second time it is being officially listed for sale. The primary goal here is to create the psychological effect for potential buyers that this is a completely fresh listing they haven't seen before. When you strategically change the price or relist the property entirely, an automated email notification about the new listing is sent out to everyone in the database, so it effectively has the same impact as a brand new listing hitting the market for the first time. However, you shouldn't just go about doing this carelessly or without a plan. When you decide to rebake a listing, you don't necessarily have to redo every single one of the listing photos from scratch, but you should at least partially update the gallery with new angles, and you should also thoroughly revise the description text to a significant extent. By doing this, you give the entire listing a much fresher and more appealing feel. Even if savvy people realize it is a relisted property, it is vital to use this specific opportunity to present the home in a new and exciting way. Furthermore, it is customary and often expected to lower the asking price at least a little bit when you choose to relist or rebake. Additionally, you should take the time to tidy up the house again, perform some simple cosmetic touch-ups to fix minor wear, and completely refresh the staging setup, preparing everything with the serious mindset that this is truly your last best chance to sell, since it is the second time around. As for the specific timing of this move, as I mentioned previously, if you still have a strong intention to sell after 3 full months have passed without a successful offer, ideally, you should aim to do it at that specific time. Seasonally speaking, spring or fall is much more advantageous for sellers. So this process of relisting is professionally known as rebaking, and if it is executed well, it can be surprisingly effective. There are actually quite a few successful cases where a property sells quickly after a thorough rebaking. Even when nothing significant has changed, perhaps just a slight price adjustment, a few high-quality new photos, and some minor tweaks to the description, I've seen many cases where the property sells almost immediately. The real problem arises if you do this second relisting and the home still doesn't sell. In that specific case, you will need to either withdraw the listing altogether or fundamentally reevaluate your entire sales approach. You may need to withdraw the listing entirely because the issue might not just be about price or condition, but could also be due to fundamental macroeconomic or market factors. So you should either conduct a thorough reevaluation or, depending on your needs, consider switching to renting, finding a tenant instead. But if you absolutely have to sell, then this would be the third attempt, wouldn't it? Now, for this third and final attempt, at this point you really have to think of it as your absolute last chance. What I would strongly recommend, though I'm not entirely sure how this will sound to you, is basically an auction-style sale. Significantly reduce the asking price as low as you possibly can, even 5% to as much as 10% below the current market price. In other words, it's a fire sale, or even a super fire sale. The remainder of the strategic process is pretty much the same as the techniques I usually use. List the property around Wednesday, hold open houses on both Saturday and Sunday that week, and try to attract as many multiple offers as possible, since the price has been lowered now. However, you need to be careful with this approach. It doesn't work just any time. You have to respond according to the market conditions. For example, at the time I'm filming this video, in February 2026, the market is slow and it's a buyer's market. In situations like these strategies do not work quickly, even if you lower the price. However, when the market is normal or even a bit hot, you might have no choice but to list the property at a price noticeably lower than the market value to attract multiple offers, and then it can sell. So, in a way, you could say this is a drastic measure. That's how I would describe it. By creating an atmosphere of a final opportunity, you can try one last time to sell. But what's even worse than everything I've mentioned so far is when, after listing the property, you don't change the price, you don't do any home improvements, you don't stage it, and you don't do anything else, you just leave it exactly as is. In my opinion, this is the most dangerous situation, because when potential buyers see this, they know. They see that the property has been sitting on the market for 3 or 4 months with no price adjustments and no changes at all. They start to wonder, are they even seriously trying to sell this place or not? So even if someone does make an offer on such a property, almost always, it's going to be a very low offer. That's why. In the end, even if you lower the price later, the property begins to feel stale and unappealing to potential buyers. That's because people keep asking, why hasn't it sold until now? And it becomes increasingly difficult to sell at a fair market value. You might end up having to make a drastic price cut, so it's actually much better to take the property off the market if it hasn't sold in about 3 months, wait for 2 or 3 months, and then relist it, rather than just leaving it up indefinitely. That's really the worst approach you could possibly take. So to summarize what I've said so far, doing nothing and just leaving the property is the worst possible option. Adjusting the price is an acknowledgement of reality and shows that you're making a genuine effort. Remaking or refreshing the property gives you a chance for a fresh start, and this often works quite well. A foreclosure sale is the final resort, a very extreme measure to consider. That's exactly what I wanted to share with you today. So once again, I want to emphasize that when you are remaking or refreshing the property, you should do it carefully and only once. That is the key point. Doing it multiple times is not effective at all. You need to prepare thoroughly with the mindset that you will do it just once, and surprisingly, properties often sell after this. However, if you relist more than twice, it can have the opposite effect because all of this shows up in the listing history. When that happens, buyers start to wait and see. If you keep going in and out 2 or 3 times, the price could drop even further. So in the end, you end up falling into a vicious cycle. So to sum up, if your property hasn't sold even after 3 months on the market, the very first thing you need to check right away is the listing price. You also need to check how much traffic you're getting from potential buyers and do a comprehensive review of all buyer feedback to see which specific comments are most common and what issues are being mentioned the most. In other words, you must thoroughly check the property's overall condition. Are there any minor maintenance issues with the house? Is there a problem with the staging? Or do you perhaps need some cosmetic upgrades or minor touch-ups? Re-examine these aspects and make sure the professional photos are up to date and of high quality. Are they too old or simply not appealing to the current market? You really need to check all of these things. As for your action plan, during the first month, monitor the situation weekly and adjust the price if it is necessary. For the next 2 to 3 months, continue to monitor every 2 weeks and revise your strategy as needed. If it still hasn't sold after 3 months, consider rebaking or relisting the home, but make sure to update things like the photos, the price, and the overall impression of the property before you relist it. If the second listing also fails, then there's really no other way. You need to fundamentally reevaluate your options. Either take it off the market, rent it out, or if you absolutely must sell at all costs, then you have to consider a much more aggressive approach. You need to be fully prepared to list your property at 5% to even 10% below the actual market price if it becomes necessary. Leaving your listing up for more than 6 months without making any changes is truly the worst thing you can do. Only relist the property once. Ultimately, for all of these steps, you must communicate very closely with your professional agent and proceed based on mutual trust. I want to summarize everything with this final point. So that's it for today. This was a bit long, but I talked in detail about what to do if your house hasn't sold after 3 months, a situation that happens quite often in this industry. Lastly, there's one more important thing I'd like to mention. Of course, it's hard to generalize every situation, but when it comes to houses, you usually see 2 distinct types. Some homes sell very quickly within 1 to 3 weeks of being listed. Then, there are others that end up being listed twice or even 3 times before they finally sell. This kind of polarization is extremely common. So, when you look at this, you realize how important it is to sell your house within the first 3 weeks of the initial listing. Some sellers understand this and act strategically, while others start at the highest possible price without much thought, spend a month or 2 testing the market, waste valuable time, and eventually lower the price and relist, only to finally get serious and sell on the second listing. You see these 2 polarized records quite often, especially with residential houses. So whether you're a realtor or a seller, don't waste your precious time, effort, or energy. As I strongly recommend, make sure to operate everything strategically so you can sell within the first 3 weeks after listing. With that, I'll end today's video. Thank you so much for watching until the very end, and I'll see you in the next video.